And speaking of the French nation, a mere set of common ideas and even common kinship bonds is but an anthropological dictum, and not a politically instantiated entity capable of enacting constitutional changes. During Frankish times, the nation had a representation in the form of assemblies sanctioned by the Salic law. It is only through such institutions of authority that a nation can have an actualized political existence, as opposed to a mere biological existence of a divergent population group existing by drift and geographic separation. Furthermore, the father of citizen king Louis-Philippe Joseph, Duc d'Orléans, would disgrace the line by becoming a revolutionist, voting for the decapitation of Louis XVI and changing his name to Philippe Égalité. That he would then get the blade himself was most deserved, but to enthrone his direct descendant also represents a moral debasement of the crown. Let us not forget that the Charter of 1814 opened up with the sentence, "Louis, by the grace of God, King of France and Navarre, to all those to whom these presents come, salutation." A clear statement of both divine right and of monarchical primacy in that the king's person is the initiator and granter of a charter. Moreover, owing to an increasing primacy of liberal deputies in the legislative elections of 1827 and 1830, restrictive measures like the July ordinances were justifiable in light of preserving the integrity of the throne. Again, per maestra, there never existed a free nation which did not have seeds of liberty as old as itself in its natural constitution, nor has any nation ever successfully attempted to develop, by its fundamental written laws, rights other than those which existed in its natural constitution. None other than Juan Donoso Cortés would undergo a similar evolution in his thought. In his 1834 essay Consideraciones sobre la Diplomacia, he would take a stance on the July monarchy, much like Dupin, but even bemoaning it not being progressive enough. When the Revolution of July appeared in the eyes of all the peoples of Europe, no one believed that this great testament of legitimacy and that great victory of a people who looked sovereign would be reduced to the catastrophe of Charles X and to the victory of the Charter. Just as the Restoration had not only been a restoration of persons, but a restoration of principles, the Revolution of July must have had the character of a revolution in ideas. Just as it had fixed Europe according to its traditional principle, it seemed that it had to fix it according to the conqueror's diplomacy's principle. Was Europe wrong when it thought that the dethroned Restoration had to carry the beginning of its existence? Was it wrong to think that another principle should occupy the throne that left the first, just as another person occupied it? No, Europe should not believe it that way, for neither Europe nor common sense conceives a fact contrary to all the antecedents of history, which is humanity, always identical with itself in the midst of the diversity of its revolutions. But diplomacy believed it, and all have seen the consequences of its principles in the two nations which were the theatre of its triumph. What a changed man Donoso Cortés would go on to become. But it was precisely that very same diplomacy that kept Europe from the prospective great victories of peoples for a good few decades. And what were the consequences of diplomacy's principles? Which diplomacy? Which diplomacy? That of Austria and Count von Beust, or that of Prussia and Bismarck. If the latter, we must share the Donoso Cortés of 1834's revulsion. But nonetheless, Charles X and the Charter were truly blessings compared to what happened when diplomacy began going in the opposite direction. So unstable were the self-determined parliamentary mobs that emerged after the fall of men like Charles X that in several European languages people had to come up with neologisms to describe the chaos. In Italy there was trasformismo, in Portugal there was rotativismo, in Spain there was caciquismo. Transformismo is the practice by which party bosses consistently form broad-tent centrist coalitions for the purposes both of providing a faux security to the best extent that parliamentarist chaos can permit and also to maintain a reliable, steady-state rate of plunder. It is a common practice to this day in party parliamentary democracies with proportional representation. Rotativismo is where two major parties periodically rotate in power and attempt to exoterically present themselves as offering highly different programs while esoterically working in common. It is, of course, the dominant practice in the United States. Caciquismo is the machine politics of patronage by party bosses. Although a fixture in American life, nominally until the Pendleton Act 1882, and in reality for a few decades afterward, the effects of civil service professionalization and ensuing bureaucratization mean that it's now largely defunct in developed democracies. Ubiquitous in the Third World. These three pathologies are all the sins of self-government, and of national assemblies in particular, and in turn these primordial sins have spawned a great deal of derivative ones. Whether or not internationalism is conducive to the health of commoners or not, it is both inevitable and essential for the ruling classes in its creation of a shared culture for running foreign affairs. Thus, men like the aforementioned Count von Fickelmont, a French-born Austrian minister whose family spread throughout Europe, Charles Joseph, 7th Prince of Ligny, a subject of the Austrian Netherlands, present Belgium, who accompanied Catherine II of Russia to a tour of her Crimean possessions, who mingled with aristocracy throughout Europe and documented it in his wonderful memoirs. Karl Nesselrode, the half-Jewish Baltic German baptized Anglican who served under the Russian Empire. Colourful figures of the ancient regime, now unthinkable. The real question is not whether we ought to have committed ethno-particularists working solely for some idea of a national interest, or the Globobo Homo Bathhouse Alliance, as Chateau Hartiste dubs it, run amok. The question is whether your internationalists are going to be men of the Holy Alliance, or Davos men. When Europe rose to overthrow its kings, it made its decision. It wanted the Davos man. Today it is suffering the consequences.